At Nigeria's SDG implementation midpoint, it is imperative to reassess the nation's strategy. Progress towards the SDGs have been mixed, with various challenges hindering success. To ensure meaningful advancements, Nigeria must prioritize poverty reduction, quality education, healthcare access, and sustainable economic growth. What are the key factors that will ensure Nigeria achieves the SDGs? Plenary 5, Half Point to 2030, Rethinking the Strategy towards Achieving the SDGs. This plenary is interpreted for our virtual audience in Pidgin, Hausa, Igbo, French, and Yoruba. Follow the on-screen instructions to gain access. Welcome to this plenary session.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to see everyone in the hall so early. Thank you for being here. And thank you to my distinguished panel for joining us as well this morning. Many of you already know the story of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but it begs some repeating for those in the audience who are here for the first time. The Sustainable Development Goals were an ambitious set of 17 goals that were agreed upon at the United Nations with its member countries in 2015. And so the title for this session today is Rethinking the Strategy at the Halfway Point of the SDGs. Because this is 2023, so we are at the halfway point of the SDGs. And with it comes an opportunity to pause and reflect. And to reflect on how countries have performed in their efforts to meet these goals. Globally, the world is off track. At the UN SDG Summit earlier last month, the evidence that was shared was that only 15% of the SDGs have been achieved so far. That's really poor performance for 7 years. While it's important to take stock and recognize how much has been done to meet these goals, today's discussion will focus more on the strategies on how we can rethink our approach to achieving the SDGs in Nigeria. More importantly for me, as a development professional, is really how we can employ strategies that will enable children and women to live healthy and productive lives. Many of you know the statistics. Nigeria has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. We also have the highest infant mortality in the world. So Nigeria is at a pivotal moment in our history. We heard the president say this yesterday. And our path to sustainability is one that will require collaboration, leadership, innovation, and fiscal responsibility. In just a moment, you will hear from each of our distinguished panelists as they give 2-minute opening remarks, and I will then lead us into a moderated discussion. So to get us started, I would like to invite Zoera to describe from your perspective the current state of progress towards achieving the SDGs in Nigeria. Zoera.
Yeah, and good morning, everybody, distinguished guests, excellencies. Thank you for having me. I think, Katya, you said it in your intro. We haven't necessarily made the progress that we thought we would make. But what I'm thinking is, we need to think about the things that we need to do, right? The SDGs are really about human capital development, right? And then driving economic progress. That's what we're trying to do. And so I think in terms of trying to optimize the 17 buckets of activities, we should rather be looking at outcomes, like what is the actual outcome that we want? So whether, we break things down specifically into education, gender equality, nutrition, health, really what we're talking about is improving human capital indices in the country. So I think, as we reflect on what hasn't worked, or what we could be doing better, the key is really to think about how do we look at what we're trying to achieve as a goal rather than 17 specific individual items. Thanks.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause? Thank you. Because I'm biased, so I will go to another lady. Your Excellency, your opening remarks, please.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank the audience for joining us at this very important conversation towards the acceleration of sustainable development goals. I recall that in 2015, I've been enumerated by the moderator that Nigeria joined the rest of the world leaders to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the successor of Millennium Development Goals with eight standalone goals. And this is 17 development goals, very ambitious and very broad. We acted quickly, unlike when MDG was adopted. We acted quickly this time around to set up the institutional framework, action plans, to drive the implementation of SDG in Nigeria. Started in 2016, and as we speak, in 2016, Nigeria found itself in the recession, economic hardship. That was the beginning of the implementation. And all through the 2019, we're still in recession, and immediately we're trying to get out of recession was when COVID came. As we speak, we have put in place all the institutional framework, the action plan, the reviews, everything completed as we speak. And it's very sad to note that globally, we only achieved 15% of the SDG implementation because of many factors. COVID-19 is one factor that ravaged the world. The second is also the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and we are experiencing another one going on now. So, in terms of Nigeria, we have done so well by putting the institutional framework in place to guide us in the implementation of that. And in two levels, the national level and sub-national level. At the sub-national level, we have integrated and domesticated SDG into these sectoral plans of the ministries, agencies, and departments of government. And of course, at the sub-national level, we're working with the 36 states government and FCT. So far, we have domesticated and integrated SDG targets and indicators into 18 states as we speak. And we plan in the next 2 years to finish the 36 states and also the local government. Knowing fully that the problems are in the state and local government. And of course, yes, we have at national level the ERGP, Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, 2017 and between 2017 to 2020, reflecting the indicator and the targets of SDGs, and the medium plan, national development plan of 2021 to 2025. Also, to have the spirit of this. So, at the national level, the public resources reflect the spirit of SDGs, but that cannot be said to the subnational government. And so where the problem lies now at the subnational government, and I'm sure that working together going forward, we will be able to, because it's supposed to be a bottom-up approach, and ownership inclusion is very, very key in achieving the SDGs. So we need more support from the subnational government. And of course, we are the first country to institutionalize the private sector advisory group for SDGs. That was done in 2017 February, where we have the private sector advisory group. And if I look at the wall, we see some of the members of the PSAG here. Dangote is one of them. And we have so many of them that are working for us to support the public sector. So the reason why this 17 is standalone is for the public sector working with the private sector in terms of resources mobilization, expertise, collaboration, and to do things differently to be able to accelerate the achievement of SDGs. So with that, I think that with all that critical stakeholders, the civil society organization, development partner, donor agencies, we still have to work together to ensure that we accelerate because of the time left. We're in the middle of the 2030. So we have to work on our rule of and be able to do the need. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Thank you for laying out all of the coordination structures and the plans that have been put in place for the SDGs in Nigeria. It was really great to hear the federal coordination that's going on and the opportunity to strengthen subnational engagement, and we'll come back to that during the Q&A. But I just wanted to recognize one of our panelists who joined us while we were speaking, Mr. Nonso Obikili from the United Nations. Please, a round of applause. And so, Nonso, not to put you on the spot, but it would be great to hear your perspectives on the SDGs.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think the previous two speakers have said it all. Globally, only about 15% of the SDGs are on target. The others are either stagnating or even falling behind. And there's lots of reasons for this. We've had a climate crisis that is still ongoing, lots of conflict around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic, and governments that are fiscally strained, to put it lightly. And so the question as we are halfway through the SDGs is what can we really do to accelerate efforts? It's not that there has been no improvement. There's been some improvements. Even here in Nigeria, there are places where they've made significant improvements in some SDGs. But the real question is how do we accelerate effort to meet the targets by 2030? And there's globally, the thinking is to try to look at the initiatives that can be cross-cutting, that can impact many SDGs at the same time. I think in Nigeria, you can think of it as the government's renewed agenda, identifying 8 points that can really make a difference across the board. On a global level, they're also thinking about high-impact initiatives that can be cross-cutting to impact both poverty, hunger, gender, and many SDGs, and to really push on those so that we can make a significant effort before 2030. And as the Senior Special Assistant to the President said, it requires a whole-of-society approach. It's not just a government agenda, not just a federal government agenda, but we require the private sector, civil society, everybody to really be part of the process to really meet the SDGs. And as the United Nations, we're always here to support the government as they make progress towards 2030. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nonso. So high impact initiatives, but also seeing that there are some bright spots in how the SDGs are being implemented and what progress is looking like. So Boye, we'll come to you now. What are your perspectives on the SDGs and how Nigeria is faring?
So good morning, everybody, and thank you also for attending the event. And you're all welcome to the participation that you've given us at NESG. Sorry, now speaking as NESG, so I'll now answer the question as Boye. I suspect the way you've thrown the question, everybody else has answered from government or public sector perspective. And the question then would be, what's the private sector perspective to this? Look, in the 70s, I think if when we were all managing businesses, or the private sector looked at its major stakeholder and its major task as being to return, in quotes, shareholder value. And that shareholder was quite narrowly defined. I think one of the big things that has happened now is that if we look at what we define stakeholder value as, stakeholder value now extends well beyond shareholder value and extends to community and the freedom to operate in communities, the ability for you to have sustainable growth as a business. And the desire for it to have sustainable growth ties back to the aims of SDGs. From pure private sector perspective, it is no longer about what we used to do, which was CSR. It's now more about long-term, more sustainable projects that give your ultimate consumer or the end user of your product, A, the capital to be able to buy your products, B, the ability and the knowledge to understand the value and whatever value you're adding into those products so that you have a continuous basis for being able to sell. I think the biggest thing that has happened in the private sector is an understanding that that is now the case. And more you hear us talking about ESG and the impact of that on our businesses, which ties back to our desire to then support the public sector in achieving its SDG aims and objectives. And those SDG aims and objectives basically will create a consumer purchasing power that's ultimately to our benefit. So I think that knowledge is the biggest transition that has occurred from a private sector point of view. And you see more and more now, private sector understanding its scope, its need to be within the community and what it needs to do, as opposed to, I would call it the traditional, we do CSR and that's our support for community.
Thank you so much, William. I like the idea of the nexus between an expanding, shareholders, who they are, and then looking at the ESG impact. Thank you for sharing those perspectives. So Zora, we'll come back to you to get us really thinking about health-related data and disparities. And this is an area that, the Gates Foundation and Aliko Dangote Foundation collaborate a lot on. Mm-hmm. Where do you see the biggest area for local communities to be involved in designing solutions towards the SDGs focused on health?
So I think that what Her Excellency had said a few minutes ago about the grassroots level of impact, how we can't bring development to people, we can't bring help. It's not really about that. It's how do we support the community to do better. So the biggest opportunity that we see, at least at the Aliko Dangote Foundation, is really having an impact on the first 1,000 days of life. Those first 1,000 days, which is from conception all the way until a child's second birthday, is the critical time where most of the potential that we'll ever have as people is defined and determined. So if children are malnourished, if their moms, let me start with the mom, right? If the mom is malnourished and has a baby, low birth weight, the baby doesn't have enough food, she doesn't have enough milk, not enough proper nutrition. By the time the child is 2, the child is malnourished. This is where we have stunting and wasting, and we have a lot of that in Nigeria. We really do. And those children, even when we save them, the damage to their brains is irreparable. So that means that we will never be able to educate them out of being stunted brain-wise. And so that then means that their entire life, they will be operating at half the potential that God put in them when they were born. And so I really think that if we really focus on those 1,000 days and make sure that people have a chance, that you survive, that you don't die, right, that you get the proper vaccination, that you make it to your second birthday with your brain fully intact, then when you go to school and have an education, and then we talk about, various opportunities to then grow and be a contributing member of society, then what we do can make sense. But I think that starting with the very basics is necessary. And that's why a lot of our interventions and a lot of the work that we do at the Aliko Dangote Foundation is really around that. How do we support the idea of having people who in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years will be productive contributors to Nigeria? The reason why we spend more money on health than we do on education is no matter how much you do on education, no matter how many classrooms you build, no matter how many, primary education things we do, if the children go there and their brains aren't functional, the result will be suboptimal. And so I think that one of the biggest opportunities we have is health, making sure that people are healthy. Next would be education, and then everything else that goes around growing people opportunities, economic development, prosperity. How do we work with communities to show them what they need to do? A lot of the work it's difficult, it's tedious, but a lot of it is basic, right? Just understanding the proper feeding techniques. A lot of behavior change communication. How do you, change mindsets around, children aren't supposed to eat meat or eggs, and, not understanding the value that beans or different oils and peanuts and things like that can really contribute to a better diet. So it's really, for me, about health and then about education. When those two are sorted, then we have a chance to make progress.
Thank you. Thank you. The first 1,000 days of life are really critical. And, prioritizing health really ties into, and education ties into your statement earlier about HCD, human capital development. And in the past, I think 4 years, Nigeria has done a lot on trying to coordinate around a human capital development agenda that looks at health, education, and employment. So it's really great to hear, your take on what needs to be prioritized when we're talking about the SDGs. So I'll come over to Your Excellency. And my question really is around, the indicators that we track for the SDGs in Nigeria. If you had a magic wand and, you could prioritize, just like Zora has said, it's health first, then education. If you had a magic wand, you've been working on this for a while, all 17 goals, which ones would you put at the top of your list?
Actually, in addition to what we prioritize already is goal 1, goal 2. Goal 1 is no poverty, goal 2, no hunger. Goal 3, good health and well-being. Goal 4, quality and inclusive education. Goal 5, gender equality. Goal 6, water and sanitation. Goal 8, good work and economic growth. And goal 10, which is reducing inequality. Those are the areas that we prioritize, because with all of that together, we can move quickly to the next level. And those are the areas that we have concluded action plan that reflect the indicators and the targets of the SDGs, so which we are working on aggressively now, especially when we have more people outside the school. The out-of-school children are not very good for us as a country, and we have to, during the COVID, we were able to get some opportunity of getting them back to their bases, their state. And we expect that that gives us opportunity to adopt them to their state and put them back in school. But unfortunately, we have not been able to achieve that. And that is our focus now going forward, to ensure that all of those schools are back, all of those schools are back in school. Without education, we can eradicate poverty, it's for sure. And of course, we're also looking at what we have caused to ourselves as a country. We know that globally we have issues on poverty, and many people have slipped into poverty globally because of COVID-19 and other causing related issues. In Nigeria, we have insurgency, boundary, farmer, herdsmen, and all of that has brought us back. And of course, then the bad policy that on the not well thought out policy, let me put it that way, not well thought out policy on currency design that have moved many people back into poverty. So all of those things must be addressed and ensure that with that we get more people through the SMS, medium and small scale businesses, ignite them to go back to work, and of course to see how the local investors will invest and of course attract foreign investors to set up in Nigeria so that we can employ those young people that are jobless. So it is very important for us and very critical for Nigeria to ensure that thousands and thousands and millions of young people are back in job. And that's why Goal 18 is very, very key to us, good work and economic growth. And while we're doing that, we'll be able to address some of the challenges of other goals. If you have job, you don't have problem with poverty and no hunger. So with job, you have addressed goal 1 and 2. You are part of the target of goal 3, because you will not be well if you are eating well and all of that. You will not be sick, so to speak. You cannot be sick. So all of that is, those are interconnected and indivisible. So we're able to get your children back in school if you want to sponsor the school. So getting job, which is a goal 8, for young people and young couples and those that are jobless now, will address many cost-cutting goals of the SDGs. So it's important for us to be able to leverage on that and work closely with the private sector, and I mean private sector, to help the public sector to achieve all of this.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. So even though you highlighted about 7 priorities, you did double down on education and employment. So I just wanted to note that. So you did end up prioritizing 2 out of your 7, so thank you. So we do have some commonality around education and, you know, how that ramps up on the SDGs. I want to come to you, Nonso, to talk about, you know, something you mentioned earlier about local solutions, examples where the SDGs, where we are seeing progress. Can you highlight 1 or 2 of those examples within your work?
Okay. Okay, thank you. I think I should start with, you know, something that the President, you know, His Excellency Bola Tinubu said at General Assembly, that the idea behind local solutions is not really to copy and paste from elsewhere and try to replicate, but really to try to adapt things that are working to your own context, to take ideas from everywhere and adapt them to work for you on a local level. So things that are working, for example, in Kenya, about 50% of all energy that's used is from renewable sources. That is a win by any standards in the agenda for sustainable energy. In Nigeria, for example, I think in Ogun State, there's a couple of places where the maternal mortality rates have reached the SDG targets already. So there are pockets of places where you can see people have figured out a way to make things work and to meet some targets. And the challenge is, how can we learn from that? How can we learn from that from a local level, but how can we also learn from the global level? There's, you know, one of the key challenges in Nigeria today is financing, for example. Last year, the government launched the Integrated National Financing Framework, which is an agenda to help mobilize financing for the SDGs. Something that's really clear there is that it's not just about government financing alone. Right? Government has a role to play in financing the SDGs, but the private sector also has a role to play in financing the SDGs. The international community has a role to play in financing SDGs, and everybody really needs to come together, to pull together, to work together, to help meet some of these goals. Learning is a good opportunity. Learning from those who have made a difference. Learning from those who are making progress. But like the President said, also adapting to the local context is just as important. I think, you know, as United Nations, we have been working in Nigeria for a long time. There's 21 agencies here, and we continue to work with governments to help meet some of the SDGs. But one thing that we can say for sure is that, you know, the people are the driving force. And people come up with ideas that work. And the challenge really is to learn from those who are making a difference and to try to replicate that elsewhere. And this is kind of the background behind some of the high impact initiatives that are being thought about. We know there's some places that have been able to transform education using different methods. What can we learn from them to transplant here, to fit to a local context that can make a difference for us? We know there are places that have been able to make a difference on food systems, to transform the way their food systems work, to work for the people. What can we learn from them to bring it here to adapt to a local context? So it's really about learning what works and adapting it to the context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nonso. I think I like the example of Ogun State, and maybe something that we should think about, you know, how do we replicate successes in some of our states, and what role do our subnational coordination forums play with that? And I know we'll come to that question a bit later. But Boye, I want to come to you to talk a little bit about, how Nigeria can effectively balance the pursuit for economic growth, as well as some of the SDGs, like the one on climate, which I know your company, you're constantly thinking about the impact on climate. And so what's your thinking there about how do we pursue the dual goal of economic growth and climate adaptation?
Well, first, I don't think it's a dual goal. I think it's a single goal, because ultimately economic growth is going to, maybe I step back a bit. The impact of the impact that climate change has in our business relates to the fact that we're a large industrial producer, and the more you see the impact of climate change on the agro side of the business, the more it has a direct relationship with the inputs that go into the food processing side of our business, which therefore correlates to the quality of the products that we can then put out there. And if you think that the three things that we want to do from a pure business or an economic point of view would be to ensure that there's adequate supply of food, volume, that there's nutritional value in food, which ties to what Zoera was talking about earlier, that even if that's the only thing that, if your meal is maybe 1 or 2 meals a day, but that there's sufficient nutritional content in that. And thirdly, and quite importantly, that it's all affordable, right? So to get those three things, you also need the quality of on the input side. If your input material, whether it's wheat that you're growing or maize that you're growing, is not of sufficient quality, then that output process doesn't work well. And the impact of climate change continues to have on that, whether it's due to weather conditions, drought, all of that. So it's clearly an important element for us in actually dealing with that value chain. And for us, therefore, we're focused on ensuring that we're able to get that quality product out there, and therefore able to play a role in ensuring that whatever impact that we're seeing in climate change, we're doing steps to ameliorate, doing things to create a better environment for farming to occur, and not just farming, but sustainable farming, right? Because it's, once again, it comes back to, it's not just about this year's farming, it's about creating sustainable methods for farming that mean whether it's direct impact of climate change or the long-term impact of climate change, you alleviate those to create those better conditions. So I don't think you separate the two. The economic outlook or the economic process that you're looking for is determined by those the input work that's done.
Great, thank you so much, Boye. I think it goes back to the earlier comment again about integration and seeing the SDGs not as 17 separate goals, but as a part of a whole. So I think your responses are really making those linkages for us. So I'd like to come back to Zoera. Given how diverse Nigeria is, across our geopolitical zones, across all our states, what strategies do you think can be adopted to ensure that the SDGs, again, we're looking forward now, we have 7 more years to 2030. What strategies can we adopt to ensure that the SDGs are culturally appropriate for our local communities? Again, it's back to this local community grassroots question.
So I don't know that there's a specific cultural dimension to some of these things that we're talking about, right? So when I said in the beginning that human capital development is the goal, right? How do we develop the people? How do we have a chance to have, people that are contributing to making Nigeria work? It's really that different people in different parts of the country have different environments. Some, areas in the southern part of the country have more water. Some parts in the north are more desert, right? So what people eat is different. For instance. You have different problems in different parts of the country. So it's not that there's a cultural, I don't know that there's specifically a cultural element. I think there's more an environmental and, just the way people live difference. Now, and when I say a difference in how we would address these issues, right? So when I think about the work that we're doing on nutrition, for instance, we have more malnutrition in the north than we do in the south. There are many reasons for that, but the facts are that there are more malnourished kids in the north of our country than in the southern part of the country. And so, of course, if we're working on nutrition specifically, a lot more resources will go towards where that particular problem is. And our approach is always going to be working with the communities, understanding what they eat, making it culturally relevant. All of our communication is with the mothers in the community, the husbands in the community, the traditional leaders, and the rulers in the community, so that everybody's in the mix together. Communities are not like, issues aren't single. Nothing is a single focused issue. That's why I keep saying that, we look at these goals as 17 different things, yes, but it's really one thing about how humanity can just be better off. So the little tweaks that we would do, an example would be how we would do a demonstration of Tom Brown. Tom Brown is a mix of different products that you would grind together and make pop with for the kids. There's some things in the north that they just don't have. They don't eat as much cassava. They don't eat as much maize in the south. So those, to me, are the cultural elements that we bump into, rather than some big, gigantic cultural difference between the north and the east and the south of Nigeria. The problems are, similar. Now, we also have, let me call them structural issues that are different. We had, some instability in the north with the insurgency that didn't necessarily happen in other parts of the country. So that's taken a toll on them. And so we have to, address that separately than we would address some of the other challenges. But really, if we focus on what the problems are, that we need a population that is alive, that survives, that is thriving. Children are going to school, they're learning, business is thriving, boy is making money and creating jobs, and everything is if that's what we focus on, then the cultural differences of what problem we have in this piece of the country versus what problem in that part of the country become not really relevant, and things that we just take on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Zohara. Before you clap, I beg to differ just a little bit, okay. Especially when you look at things like gender equality, right, or even healthcare. Maybe if we nuance it around just those two, there are some cultural sensitivities around that, looking at the north-south and, different communities. What about if you look at it from that perspective?
So the reason why I'm not a big fan of the big bucket generalizations, in the north, girls don't go to school, we have too many kids, and in the south, they're more equal. The reason I'm saying that that's not necessarily the case is I'm from the north, and I'm a Christian, and I only have 2 kids, and I went to school, right? So, and people like me exist. It's not like there's a typical Hausa northern person, and there's an absolutely typical Yoruba or Igbo or Ijaw. Like, that's what I'm saying is not necessarily true. We might have some differences, but some of the differences are maybe more religious. We have Muslims in the north, we have Muslims in the south, we have Christians in the north, Christians in the south. You have similarities in how people behave religiously, but I'm not really a big believer that we have these these gigantic differences, and that it's a fact that everybody in the north is behaving a certain way and everybody in other parts of the country is behaving another way. And I think that if we start thinking about how do we solve, again, back to the problem of health, education, opportunity, development, prosperity, how can Nigeria be the best Nigeria that Nigeria can be? I think if we look at it as that big piece that we want to attack, then the differences that we have amongst ourselves are less. We should focus more on what we're trying to do rather than on the differences that we have on the margins amongst our population.
Great,
that's what I honestly believe.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. So, Your Excellency, I'll come to you now. A conversation that we were having earlier was really about subnational engagement. And you framed in your opening statement all the work that's happening at the federal level, and you even said that where there needs to be more work done is with the states. So can you tell us a bit about some of the challenges that have led you to this conclusion, and perhaps what you see as a path forward to that subnational engagement?
I think going forward and to be able to accelerate the achievement of SDG, that is very necessary at this time, is to try to implement the report of the Integrated National Financing Framework that has been launched. Last year, we have 2 countries now, Nigeria and Indonesia, that have launched so far, and the conversation came up during the last GA, and we're asked to do some peer review mechanism with some other country, how we arrived at that. And what is important to us now is to start the implementation of the INFF, which is tools, very important tools for the operationalization of the Addis Ababa agenda, action agenda. Addis Ababa action agenda for financing the SDGs. With that, I think we'll be able to work more closely with the private sector for both public and private domestic mobilization, as well as international private and donor financial resources, domestic resources and international resources to support the SDG. Ordinarily, from the statistics and what we got, was to have to sponsor, to finance SDG require about $100 billion annually. And what we have at the moment, both the subnational budget, subnational government budget, and the national government is not up to half of that put together. So there's need to source for both domestic resources, both at the private sector and the public sector. Not necessarily have to increase our taxes, but we have to get more people in the tax net. That's very key and important for us. 1, 2, to also, we're in the process of putting the seed capital for the integrated financing web for other donors and development partners to add to it, as well as the private sector, local, to add to it by 2024. So with that, I think we would be able to move forward. And again, the engagement of the subnational government is very key. The local government are the basis where the problem lies. They have to be fully engaged and to understand the context of the SDG and what it seems to do for our people. So the local government and the state government must come to realization that they must join hands with the national government to ensure that we deliver the social contract that we have with the people. They have delivered their own by electing us into office. So we must replicate that by making sure that the strong in our different community and the weak in our different community are very strong, and the infrastructure gets to people wherever they are, either in the riverine community, either in the rural communities, wherever they are, they must be happy. So because they want to be happy, that was why they signed the social contract with us, and by electing us to be their leaders. So that must sink well in our ears and must be a thing that we'll prioritize. So we are working more now. We are going to work more with the subnational government to ensure that they take ownership, sense of inclusion, because if you have these people at the grassroots level and they don't take ownership of what we are doing, there will be sustainability. So we have to work with them closely and ensure that we have understanding of what each and every one of us needs to do. By integrating the SDG into their subnational, their policy and sectoral plan, will give us that on an annual basis when their budget is being prepared, reflects the spirit of all of the goals of the SDGs as planned. And that will help us quickly to get, with 7 years is we can see as if make some significant impact in the life of our people. And I'm sure that now that we're having some relative peace in the country now, I think that we will make a very substantive progress going forward. So eventually is to implement the INFF, Integrated National Principle, and to work closely more with the private sector and the subnational government.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. So we're coming close to the end of this session, but I do want to ask our last two questions. Nonso, we can't end this conversation without talking about data. So I'd like you to maybe briefly just share some ideas about how we are tracking the indicators for the SDGs and perhaps what are some best practices around that. And how do we leverage technology to really ensure that this data that we're collecting can be better used for decision-making across the country?
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's generally accepted that if you want to improve on something, first you have to track it. You have to know where you are to know where you're going. And so that speaks to the importance of data in really understanding how much improvement we are or are not making in meeting the SDGs. And in that context, in thinking about how to better capture data, the first question is, well, what is new that we can use? And like you likely mentioned, digital tools have become the norm. I think in Nigeria, we've moved from somewhere around 0% who had no access to mobile phones, for example, to somewhere around 90%. So these are tools that we can use to better improve our data gathering and data collection methodologies. Globally, there's a standard framework for measuring the SDGs. I think Nigeria was key in designing that framework and also accept that framework. The MBS is really the clearinghouse for the government in collecting that data. In the past, we've typically used surveys to get the most relevant data, but what's becoming clear now is that administrative data is becoming more and more important. Data that's collected on a regular basis, data that's collected more frequently and more often from more sources can really be key in kind of identifying where there are gaps and potential for improvement. So again, the message, I guess, speaking to what Her Excellency has said, is that the subnationals are really where the data gathering process starts from. Everybody talks about the MBS, but each state has the statistical agency as well that is supposed to be working together to collect data on that level that now feeds into the national data. If you think of an example that we recently had in Nigeria, which is around social protection, and how do we deliver social protection to people who are in need from the forced subsidy removal, the question of data came up, and the question was, do we trust the data that we have? And that really starts with really ensuring that everybody who is involved in the data collection process, from the federal government to the state governments to local governments, are part of the data collection process. And to use new tools that we have, new digital technologies to make that process faster and more efficient. So I think that's really the direction to go. On the one hand, taking advantage of digital tools that we now have. On the other hand, ensuring that everybody participates, especially at state and local level, in collecting this data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nonso. Very clear thinking around how we capitalize on the data that we have. So Boye, I'll come to you for our last question, and it's really one that speaks to the heart of why we're all here. And it's how can we help catalyze resources from the private sector for the SDGs?
And I presume that question came because when I said Boye had the money, right? No, as I said, I alluded to earlier that if you look at it from the private sector point of view now, the idea of stakeholder value or value creation relates to the actual meeting of the SDG goals and targets. So from a business point of view, or from that private sector then stance point of view, there needs to be a significant amount of resources that's put aside to actually ensure that we support the attainment of those goals. The attainment of those goals themselves lead to significant economic development, GDP growth, and as that growth comes, a significant amount of return on economic activity that we've got. Now, today, if you take what's happening, in particular on the ESG framework, which is a big driver to of SDG development, if private sector is generally looking for lower cost of funds in order to support its business. The ability to get that now exists largely in that space. If you go into the international market space, if you want to talk about funding and the ability to get low cost funding, one of the first things you're going to be asked about is your ESG reporting. Now, in a climate where we see high interest rates coming here, we see the difficulty in getting finance, that's an attractive route for us to go in order to be able to generate capital. Now, for us to get that though, we have to do the ESG work, we have to do the documentation. And not just the documentation these days, those ESG assessments are extremely detailed in ensuring that there is real outcome. That in itself is a big driver, right? Because when you know that's what you're going for, then you put the necessary resources in place to ensure that you put yourself in the best position to be able to get that funding available. I'll then come back to also what Hexon said in relation to subnationals. I think there's an old advert, and I'm not saying how old I am by saying this, that said, it says, think local, act global, right? From a business point of view, once again, or from the private sector point of view, all our businesses are in the local areas, whether it's in the local government or in the subnational. Two particular elements that relate to the SDG goals. Number one, I think, is poverty, and number 9, which is infrastructure development. Those are two real areas where a relationship between us and the subnationals would work extremely well. I think the federal government started running a tax incentive scheme for roads. One of the schemes we should be looking at is one that ties to access within the local communities in which we operate, and the ability for us to use funding to support that access. And once again, that's something that's real, measurable, and deliverable by us, because it's something that's easier to do. So I think if we look at those, we will find that there's sufficient motivation for us to put in the necessary resources to be able to achieve the targets that have been set.
Thank you so much, Boye. Her Excellency has a comment to make.
Okay, when I refer to the private resources, private sector resources, I mean that comes in 2 dimensions. One is about CSR, the popular CSR, and 2 is on investment. You recall the road infrastructure program that federal government launched a few years ago. It's about tax holidays, and same thing can come under different sectors: education sector, health sector, infrastructure, renewable energy, and all of that. So if the private sector can put themselves in different silos, taking different sectors for investment, then the federal government is ready to do some tax holiday, and then if your paper is already, depending on what you want, because all of these things cannot be done by government unless we deceive ourselves. It must be private and public working together, and that's why Goal 17 is a standalone, to encourage the private sector to work the public sector. So the investment in education can be, we have many universities now privately owned to complement what the government is doing, and they are making so much return on investment. It can come on health sector, having one-stop shop health institution, and do all of that. They invest in public infrastructures where you have tax holiday. So unless we come together as a private sector trying to invest in this, and that has been embedded in our Integrated National Financing Framework report, which will be made known, will implement very quickly before the end of this year. We'll start the implementation. So the private sector can come and they have to show interest. They have to show commitment and partnership so that we can move forward and it will help us. So I want to implore and use this opportunity to implore the captain of industry to come up and work with government, to use expertise, resources, work with the public sector so that we can accelerate the achievement of the goals.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. So we've had some really strong points and I think areas of alignment that I just want to highlight, before we close this session. And I think the biggest one for me is the conversation around, looking at the SDGs as part of a whole and not as separate components, separate goals. And I think the linkage between Nigeria's human capital agenda is one big piece of this work where the SDGs can really interconnect. I think the other one is about local solutions and the idea or the fact that we do have examples of success around the country. But what we often don't, one of the challenges is we don't really hear about them, right? And so, looking at how do we tell these stories of success so that other states are able to learn from and replicate. And I think to link that with the Nigeria Governors Forum, we were talking about earlier, it's a peer learning platform, and I think a lot of discussion was had yesterday about how the Nigerian Governors Forum could really help with bubbling up some of these examples of success that other states can learn from. The other conversation I thought was really important was around financing for the SDGs. So you heard about the integrated financial framework, which was actually launched, I think, in 2021. So 2022. So there's more to come on that in terms of how Nigeria is implementing this financing framework. But it's really this idea of pooling resources to be able to fund the SDGs. And I think the private sector will be a very critical and crucial partner for that. We talked about also, attracting private sector investment through some of the existing funds, the infrastructure fund that is available, but there are also other, you have the sustainable banking principles. There are several other mechanisms that exist to incentivize private sector to commit to and to support the SDGs. And I think the idea that Boye shared about how it's actually in the DNA, or should be in the DNA of businesses, to take care of people in their communities and to ensure health and livelihoods are sustained is very crucial. And then I think to wrap this all up, I just wanted to repeat, there was a point about data, right? Because again, we can do all of this great work, but if we don't track it, if we don't measure it, it really means nothing, and we won't even know how much progress we would have made. So I think the next 7 years are really critical for us to be able to strengthen our data systems, using digital technology, seeing what role the Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy can even play in this is also critical.
I think part of what we have done is to train the planning officers all across the MDAs at the national government, at the national level, and the planning officer at the state level to be able to generate the data, process data, and report data. That has been completed, and working with the National Bureau of Statistics, who coordinates the process data and report data regularly. So the training must not be one sort of, we have to continue with that. And also the data bond has been signed among the 36 state governments and the ministry and department that we coordinate. So going forward, we will continue to do that, to ensure that data is being processed, being generated, processed, and reported.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. So thank you. So one last comment from me, just to, at the beginning I said that we'll need 3 things to move the SDGs forward. Collaboration, fiscal responsibility, and innovation. And I think everything that has been shared has tied in very nicely with those three ideas. So thank you so much for your patience, and thank you to our distinguished panelists for all of their contributions. Thank you.